Some silences don't ask to be understood. They just wait to be noticed. There's a type of silence that doesn't arrive with warning. It doesn't announce itself through conflict or confrontation. It simply begins to exist in the space where connection used to be. At first, it feels like nothing, just the natural rhythm of two lives moving at different speeds. But over time, that silence begins to change. It stops feeling like a pause and starts feeling like a presence. And the person experiencing it starts to notice things they didn't notice before. The timing of replies, the tone behind words, the absence of questions that used to come naturally. These aren't isolated incidents. They're behavioral patterns, quiet shifts in emotional behavior that, when viewed together, reveal something larger taking shape. This is not about overanalyzing a single missed call or reading too much into one short text. This is about recognizing when a series of small behaviors begin to form a structure that suggests emotional distance rather than temporary distraction. Relationship psychology teaches us that people communicate through more than words. They communicate through presence, through consistency, through the effort they choose to invest or withdraw. And when that effort begins to fade, when emotional withdrawal becomes the baseline rather than the exception, the silence between two people stops being neutral. It becomes information. It becomes a language that the body understands even when the mind resists it. What makes this particularly difficult is that the shift often happens without a clear turning point. There's no conversation where everything changes. No moment where one person officially decides to pull away. Just a slow, steady recalibration of attachment patterns. A quiet erosion of reciprocity, attunement, and presence. And the person left navigating that erosion finds themselves in a strange position. They can feel that something has changed, but they have no concrete event to point to. So they begin to search. They begin to watch. They begin to track the psychological dynamics of behavior that no longer matches what it used to be. And in that process of observation, they come to understand something they didn't want to face. That the silence they've been living in is not a gap waiting to be filled. It's a statement that has already been made. This is an investigation into that silence. Not to assign blame, not to label anyone as wrong, but to understand what happens when emotional behavior shifts beneath the surface of a relationship. When communication breakdown occurs not through argument, but through absence. When respect erosion takes place not in what is said, but in what is no longer done. This is about the patterns people leave behind when they begin to leave emotionally, even while they remain physically present. And it's about the moment when that silence finally becomes impossible to ignore. There's a silence that arrives without introduction. It doesn't storm in or declare its presence. It simply settles into the space between two people like dust on a surface no one's been watching. At first, it feels like nothing, a pause, a breath, the natural ebb of conversation. But somewhere beneath the surface, something shifts. The quality of that silence begins to change. It stops feeling like rest and starts feeling like absence. This is where relationship psychology quietly draws its first line between comfort and disconnection, though neither person may notice it yet. The shift doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. It operates in the undertones of behavior, in the slight delay before a response, in the way a message sits unread just a little longer than it used to. These are not dramatic changes. They are subtle recalibrations in emotional behavior, small enough to be dismissed as coincidence or timing. But behavior analysis teaches us that the smallest adjustments often carry the heaviest meaning. What changes isn't always what is said. What changes is the space around what is said. The tone, the rhythm, the presence behind the words. Most people don't feel this shift consciously at first. They feel it in their body, a faint unease, a question that lingers without language. Something feels off, but there's no evidence to justify the feeling. This is how psychological dynamics begin to alter attachment patterns without permission. The mind searches for clarity while the nervous system quietly registers a change in emotional distance. There is no argument, no confrontation, no visible rupture. Just a silence that used to mean one thing and now, without explanation, seems to mean another. And that's when the real observation begins. Because once the silence changes, the person feeling it starts watching more closely. They begin to notice timing. They begin to notice tone. They begin to measure the space between messages, between calls, between moments of attention. The silence itself becomes a language, and the mind, without realizing it, starts translating. What it finds isn't always comforting. Sometimes, what it finds is a pattern that hasn't fully formed yet, but is already quietly taking shape. The pauses begin to stretch. What used to take minutes now takes hours. What used to take hours now takes days. And when the response finally arrives, it often carries no weight. Just enough words to acknowledge presence without offering substance. Been busy? Crazy week. I'll explain later. These phrases become placeholders, verbal gestures that fill space without filling meaning. The explanations, when they come, are never quite complete. They hover at the edge of believability, not because they're lies, but because they lack the texture of real engagement. This is where communication breakdown begins, not with silence alone, but with silence dressed as explanation. The lengthening of these pauses operates on two levels. On the surface, it appears circumstantial. Life happens, schedules collide, energy dips. But beneath that surface, something else is occurring. Emotional withdrawal doesn't always look like anger or coldness. Sometimes it looks like distraction. Sometimes it looks like fatigue. And sometimes it looks like someone who is still responding, still present in form, but no longer present in emotional behavior. The body replies, the heart does not. Relationship dynamics shift when one person continues to show up in structure while disappearing in substance. What makes this phase so disorienting is the lack of clarity. There is no clean break, no honest declaration of distance. Instead, there is a slow erosion of consistency. Messages arrive, but they feel hollow. Plans are made, but they lack follow-through. The person is still there, technically, but the version of them that used to lean in, that used to prioritize, that used to meet effort with effort, has quietly receded. This is not always intentional. In many cases, it reflects unmet emotional needs or internal emotional triggers that haven't been named. But intention doesn't change the effect. The one left waiting begins to feel the weight of that vagueness like a stone in the chest. And so the mind does what it always does when clarity is absent. It begins to fill the gaps. It searches for meaning in tone. It rereads messages looking for subtext. It measures the time between responses like a heartbeat, trying to detect irregularity. This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition. The brain is doing what it was designed to do: assess safety, predict behavior, protect attachment. But when the data keeps coming back inconclusive, when the explanations remain vague and the pauses keep lengthening, the mind doesn't settle. It sharpens. And it starts looking not just at what is said, but at what continues to be withheld. When words lose their reliability, the body turns to other evidence. Tone becomes a variable worth studying. Timing becomes data. And what is not said, what is avoided, deflected, or left unaddressed, becomes the loudest signal of all. This is where behavior analysis shifts from passive observation to active interpretation. The person on the receiving end of this emotional distance begins to listen differently. They stop taking statements at face value and start listening for what sits beneath them. A short reply isn't just short, it's clipped. A delayed response isn't just late, it's deprioritized. The absence of a question, the lack of follow-up, the missing warmth, all of it starts to register as meaningful. This kind of hypervigilance is often misunderstood. It's easy to label it as overthinking, as insecurity, as someone reading too much into things. But psychological dynamics tell a different story. When attachment patterns are threatened, the nervous system doesn't overreact. It responds to real shifts in relational safety. The person isn't imagining distance. They're detecting it. And they're doing so through the only channels still open. Micro-behaviors, subtle shifts in engagement, the emotional texture of interactions that no longer feel reciprocal. What they're experiencing isn't delusion. It's attunement to a relationship that is changing beneath the surface. The search for meaning in these small details can feel exhausting. It requires constant evaluation, constant recalibration. Every message is scanned for clues. Every pause is measured. Every interaction is compared to the baseline of how things used to be. And the harder someone works to decode the behavior of the other person, the more they realize that clarity isn't coming. There are no confessions, no explanations, no moments where everything suddenly makes sense. There is only a growing collection of small behaviors that, when viewed together, begin to form a shape. A shape that looks less like connection and more like retreat. And this is where the real shift occurs. Not in the relationship itself, but in the person doing the observing. Because once you start searching for meaning in what isn't said, once you start tracking tone and timing like forensic evidence, you're no longer simply participating in the relationship. You're studying it. And that distance, that quiet act of stepping back to assess what's happening, marks the beginning of something else. A recognition that something foundational has already started to crack, even if no one has said it out loud yet. At first, the absences feel random. A missed call here, a forgotten reply there. A plan that falls through without much explanation. Each one, taken alone, seems forgivable. Life gets busy, people get distracted, things slip through the cracks. But when these moments begin to repeat, when they start occurring with a regularity that can't quite be dismissed as coincidence, they stop feeling accidental. They begin to form a rhythm. Not a loud one, not an obvious one, but a rhythm nonetheless. And that rhythm, quiet as it is, becomes the structure through which emotional detachment moves unnoticed into the everyday. This repetition is what separates a single lapse from a behavioral pattern. 1 absence is an event. 3 absences is a trend. 5 absences is a language. The person experiencing this doesn't always name it right away. They may still make excuses, still offer the benefit of the doubt, still try to believe that next time will be different. But the body knows. The nervous system registers the pattern before the mind is willing to accept it. Relationship patterns don't require conscious acknowledgement to affect someone. They simply repeat, and in repeating, they teach. They teach what to expect. They teach where the priority lies. They teach how much space one person is willing to let grow between them and another. What makes this phase particularly difficult is that the person pulling away often doesn't see it as withdrawal. To them, it may feel like self-preservation, like needing space, like managing their own emotional load. And in some cases, it is. But the effect remains the same. The other person is left navigating a series of small disappointments that never get addressed, a pattern of behavior that never gets named. There is no conversation about what's changing. There is only the quiet repetition of absence, and the slow adjustment to a new normal where connection is no longer assumed. It's hoped for, and increasingly, not found. And so the mind begins to track it, not out of malice, not out of suspicion, but out of survival. Because when someone you care about starts to disappear in increments, when their presence becomes inconsistent and their attention becomes conditional, the only way to make sense of it is to watch, to notice, to catalog the small ways in which they are no longer showing up. This is not weakness. This is the brain doing what it does when attachment is threatened. It gathers evidence, it prepares. And somewhere in that preparation, it begins to understand that these small absences are building towards something larger. There's a moment in relationship dynamics when the quality of emotional responsiveness begins to dull. It doesn't vanish. It flattens. The person is still there, still replying, still engaged in the mechanical sense. But the emotional texture that used to live inside those exchanges is gone. What used to be warmth becomes neutrality. What used to be curiosity becomes passivity. What used to feel like two people emotionally synced to each other now feels like one person speaking and the other simply present. This is where emotional behavior shifts from active to reactive, from connected to distant, from attuned to detached. The slowness of their responses mirrors the flatness of their tone. Messages take longer to arrive, and when they do, they carry less feeling. There's no excitement, no spontaneity, no trace of the energy that used to pulse between them. Questions go unanswered. Vulnerability is met with brevity. What should spark conversation instead lands in silence. This isn't always intentional cruelty. It's often a sign of someone who has emotionally exited without physically leaving. Their body is still in proximity. Their attention is elsewhere. And the person left trying to reach them begins to feel the full weight of that absence, even as the other person remains technically reachable. What this does, over time, is erode the sense of emotional safety. When someone stops responding to your emotional cues, when they stop matching your energy, when they stop meeting you where you are, the relationship begins to feel one-sided. Not because one person is doing more, though that may also be true, but because one person is feeling more. And the imbalance isn't about tasks or labor. It's about presence. It's about whether the other person is still emotionally invested in the space between you, or whether they've quietly begun to withdraw that investment without saying so. This is where respect erosion begins to take root. Because when emotional responses become slow and flat, when attunement disappears, what's being communicated, intentionally or not, is a lack of priority. The message, unspoken but clear, is that this connection no longer holds the same weight it once did. And the person on the other side of that message doesn't need it explained. They feel it in every delayed reply, every flat tone, every moment where their emotional bid goes unmet. They feel it in the growing realization that something fundamental has already shifted out of balance. Effort, when it flows in only one direction, eventually becomes visible. Not immediately. At first, it's easy to rationalize. Maybe they're going through something. Maybe they need space. Maybe this is temporary. But as days turn into weeks, as weeks stretch into patterns, the imbalance stops being something that can be explained away. One person is initiating. One person is asking questions. One person is trying to keep the connection alive. And the other person is simply responding, sometimes barely, sometimes not at all. This is where relationship psychology reveals one of its quietest truths. Effort that isn't mirrored doesn't just go unnoticed. It gets absorbed, depleted, and eventually questioned. The person carrying the weight of the connection begins to feel it physically. There's a fatigue that comes with being the only one reaching out, the only one remembering, the only one trying to bridge the distance. Every message sent without a matching question in return. Every plan proposed without reciprocation. Every vulnerable moment met with silence or minimal acknowledgement. These aren't isolated incidents anymore. They're the structure of the relationship now. And the person doing the work begins to realize that they are not building something together. They are maintaining something alone, and maintenance without partnership is exhausting. What makes this imbalance particularly painful is that it often comes without explanation. There's no fight, no accusation, no clear moment where one person declares they're no longer invested. There's just a slow, steady withdrawal of effort. The other person stops planning. They stop asking. They stop showing up in the small ways that signal care. And when confronted, gently, carefully, because the person still holding on is afraid of pushing too hard, the response is often vague. "I've just been stressed. I didn't realize. I'll try harder." But the effort doesn't change, the pattern doesn't shift, and the imbalance, instead of correcting, deepens. This is where attachment patterns begin to fracture. Because when one person is consistently giving more than they receive, when their emotional investment is met with passivity, the nervous system starts to ask a different question. Not, "What did I do wrong?" but, "Why am I still trying?" And that question, once it surfaces, changes everything. It's the beginning of a quiet detachment of their own, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. Because at some point, the mind stops trying to balance what was never meant to be carried alone, and starts measuring the cost of continuing to try. There comes a point where the behavior stops looking like distraction and starts looking like distance. Distraction is temporary. Distraction has an explanation. Distraction resolves when the external pressure lifts. But distance doesn't operate that way. Distance is structural. It's consistent. It doesn't shift when the work week ends or when stress subsides. It remains steady and unmoved, even in moments where connection should naturally occur. This is where behavior analysis becomes unavoidable. Because once the pattern is clear, once the consistency of withdrawal is undeniable, it's no longer possible to attribute it to circumstance. What's being observed isn't a phase, it's a position. The patterns reveal themselves in predictable ways. The person who used to initiate now waits. The person who used to share openly now withholds. The person who used to prioritize the relationship now treats it as optional, something to tend to when convenient, rather than something to protect. These aren't occasional slip-ups, they're repeated behaviors that form a baseline. And that baseline tells a story that words often refuse to tell. It says, I am here, but I am not invested. I am responding, but I am not engaged. I am present in form, but I have already begun to leave in feeling. What this does to the other person is profound. Because once you recognize the pattern, once you see that the distance isn't situational, but intentional, or at least sustained without resistance, you can't unsee it. Every interaction is now filtered through that awareness. Every message, every silence, every moment of reduced effort is no longer interpreted generously. It's interpreted accurately. And accuracy in this case is painful. Because what it reveals is that the person you're trying to reach has already emotionally stepped back. They haven't announced it. They haven't ended anything. But they have shifted their position. And that shift, quiet as it is, changes the entire landscape of the relationship. This is where psychological dynamics become undeniable. The mind stops looking for excuses and starts looking at evidence. And the evidence, when laid out honestly, points to the same conclusion. This is not someone who is temporarily unavailable. This is someone who has made distance their default. And once that truth settles in, once the pattern is fully recognized, the person observing it is left with a choice they didn't want to face. Not whether to fight for the relationship, but whether fighting for it still makes sense. Somewhere along the way, the distance stops feeling like an interruption and starts feeling like the standard. The long pauses between messages, the surface-level conversations, the lack of spontaneity, the absence of depth, the feeling that everything now requires effort where it used to flow naturally. At first, these changes felt jarring, but after enough repetition, they begin to feel expected. The mind, adaptable as it is, adjusts. It stops waiting for things to return to how they were. It stops holding space for the version of the relationship that used to exist. And in that adjustment, something quietly breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a small, internal recognition that this reduced, diluted version of connection has become the norm. This normalization is one of the most insidious aspects of emotional withdrawal. Because once the nervous system accepts the new baseline, once it stops being surprised by the lack of effort or presence, the relationship begins to operate in a kind of low-grade numbness. There's no acute pain anymore, no sharp disappointment with every unmet expectation. There's just a dull awareness that things are different now. And that difference is no longer temporary. The person who used to feel anxious waiting for a reply now feels nothing. The person who used to hope for change now expects continuity. And that shift, from hope to resignation, is where emotional detachment quietly takes root. What makes this phase so dangerous is that it often goes unspoken. Neither person names it. The one pulling away doesn't acknowledge that they've created distance. The one feeling it doesn't confront the pattern because they've already adapted to it. And so the relationship continues, not because it's healthy, not because it's fulfilling, but because it's familiar. It exists in a kind of stasis, alive in structure, dead in substance. And both people, in different ways, begin to accept that this is simply what it is now. Not what they wanted, not what they hoped for, but what it has quietly become. And yet, beneath that acceptance, something is still paying attention. Because even when the mind adjusts, even when the heart goes numb, the body remembers what connection used to feel like. It remembers the ease, the reciprocity, the presence that didn't require constant effort to maintain. And in quiet moments, when the noise of adaptation fades, that memory surfaces, not as nostalgia, as clarity, a reminder that what has become normal was never supposed to feel this empty. Reciprocity doesn't die in a single moment. It fades incrementally, across a series of small exchanges where one person gives and the other no longer gives back. There's no announcement, no breakup, no clean line that marks the before and after. Just a slow, steady erosion of balance. One person keeps showing up, asking, initiating, caring, and the other person doesn't. Not in equal measure. Not with the same energy. Not with the same presence. And because the loss happens gradually, because there's no dramatic event to point to, it becomes almost impossible to name when the relationship stopped being mutual. It just did. Somewhere along the way, without permission, without acknowledgement, the exchange became one-sided. This is where relationship patterns reveal their deepest impact. Because when reciprocity fades, what fades with it is the feeling of being seen, valued, and prioritized. The person still investing begins to feel invisible. Their effort goes unmatched. Their care goes unreciprocated. Their emotional bids, small and large, are met with indifference or minimal response. And the absence of that return, over time, creates a kind of relational hunger. A longing not for grand gestures, but for the basic acknowledgement that they matter, that their presence is noticed, that their effort is not being taken for granted. But that acknowledgement doesn't come, and the silence where it should be speaks louder than words ever could. What makes this so disorienting is the lack of closure. There's no fight to reference, no clear betrayal to process, no moment where the relationship definitively ended. It just became less connected, less balanced, less alive. And because there's no event to grieve, the person experiencing the loss often struggles to justify their own feelings. They question whether they're overreacting, whether they're expecting too much, whether they should just accept that people change and relationships evolve. But deep down, they know this isn't evolution. This is abandonment in slow motion. This is someone choosing, through repeated inaction, to stop meeting them halfway. And so the person who has been carrying the relationship begins to let go. Not all at once. Not with anger or declaration, but quietly, in the same way the other person withdrew. They stop reaching out as much. They stop hoping for change. They stop waiting for the other person to remember what they used to be to each other. And in that letting go, they begin to recognize something they've been avoiding, that the loss has already happened. The relationship they're mourning ended a long time ago. What remains now is just the outline of what it used to be. And that outline, no matter how familiar, can't hold the weight of what's no longer there. Eventually, the silence stops being something you can talk yourself out of. It stops being something you can rationalize, explain away, or convince yourself is temporary. It becomes too loud, too consistent, too present to dismiss. And in that moment, when the silence finally announces itself fully, there is no confusion left. Just clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't comfort, doesn't reassure, but simply reveals what has been true for longer than you wanted to admit. The other person has left, not physically, not officially, but emotionally, they are gone. And the silence you've been navigating, analyzing, trying to decode, it was never a pause. It was an answer. This is where emotional behavior reaches its conclusion. Because silence, when sustained long enough, becomes a choice. It becomes a statement about priority, about investment, about where someone has decided to place their attention. And the person on the other side of that silence, the one who has been waiting, hoping, trying to understand, they finally stop waiting. Not because they stop caring, but because they stop being willing to interpret absence as anything other than what it is. The relationship didn't end in a fight. It didn't end with words. It ended in the space between words, in the accumulation of everything that was no longer said, no longer felt, no longer returned. What this moment brings is not relief, but a strange kind of stillness. There's grief, yes, but it's not the grief of sudden loss. It's the grief of finally admitting what you've known for a while, that the person you were holding space for stopped holding space for you, that the connection you were protecting had already been let go of by the other person, that you were alone in the effort long before you were ready to see it. And now that you see it, now that the silence has made itself undeniable, there's nothing left to decode. There's only the choice of what to do with the truth you've been given. And that truth, as painful as it is, carries a kind of clarity that nothing else could provide. Because once the silence becomes impossible to ignore, once the pattern is fully visible, the question is no longer, what does this mean? The question becomes, what do I do now that I know? And that question, unlike all the others that came before it, doesn't require interpretation. It only requires honesty. The kind of honesty that acknowledges when something has ended. The kind of honesty that stops chasing what has already walked away. The kind of honesty that understands some silences are not meant to be filled. They are meant to be heard. Silence, when left uninterrupted long enough, becomes its own form of clarity. It doesn't need translation. It doesn't require further investigation. What it required was attention, and you gave it that. You noticed the patterns. You tracked the shifts. You allowed yourself to see what was actually happening beneath the surface of words that no longer carried weight. And now you're here, standing in the space where denial used to be, holding a truth that doesn't offer comfort, but does offer something more valuable. Accuracy. The relationship didn't collapse in a single moment. It dissolved across a series of quiet withdrawals, small absences, and unmet emotional needs that were never addressed. And the silence that remains is not a question anymore. It's a conclusion. What you do with that conclusion is not something that can be prescribed. There's no script for how to move through the awareness that someone has already left you emotionally, even if they haven't said the words. But there is a kind of power in simply knowing, in no longer searching for meaning in silence that has already spoken, in no longer waiting for someone to return to a version of themselves they've chosen not to be. The pattern has shown itself fully. The psychological dynamics have played out. And the only thing left to do is decide whether you will continue holding space for someone who stopped holding space for you. The silence doesn't need you to fill it. It needs you to respect what it has revealed. But before you go, there's something else that matters here. Because silence doesn't just live in what isn't said. It also lives in what was asked and never answered. The questions that hung in the air, waiting for acknowledgement that never came. The moments where you reached for clarity and were met with deflection, avoidance, or vague reassurances that solved nothing. If the silence in this video felt familiar, if it resonated with something you've been navigating, then you need to watch the previous video. The questions that were never answered and never left. That video picks up where this one quietly hands off. It examines the weight of unanswered questions, the psychological cost of being left in ambiguity, and what it does to someone when the person they're trying to reach refuses to meet them with honesty. The two videos together form a complete picture, not just of how people withdraw, but of how that withdrawal leaves you holding pieces of a conversation that was never finished. Don't skip it. This isn't optional viewing. It's the other half of what you just watched. If this resonated, if you're starting to see your own patterns reflected back at you with uncomfortable accuracy, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because we're not here to sell you hope or hand you fixes. We're here to help you see clearly. And sometimes, clarity is the only thing that moves you forward.